Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Friday Forum at the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Jim Foster, director of the club, and I'm especially pleased that we are presenting this program in partnership with the Western Reserve Land Conservancy. The Land Conservancy has preserved more than 35,000 acres in this region, and they work closely with the Nature Conservancy on many fronts. So it is a particular privilege that I invite Rich Cochran to the podium to introduce our speaker. Rich has served as president and CEO of the Land Conservancy since its founding in 2006 and has been actively involved in conservation and land preservation for almost 20 years. Rich?
Thank you, Jim, as always. It's a pleasure and a privilege. Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club. Today, it is my sincere privilege to introduce and welcome an eminent leader. Mark Tercek, as I think everyone knows, serves as president and CEO of the world's largest, most successful conservation organization. Happily, he's also a Clevelander, although unfortunately he now lives in Washington, D.C. area. Other than the unfortunate fact that he attended both Western Reserve Academy and Williams College, both of which are rivals of my alma maters, he is an amazing success story. Despite that, having served in numerous executive roles at Goldman Sachs prior to his current role at the Nature Conservancy. Mark recently wrote a very important book, which we'll learn more about today, called Nature's Fortune. His book provides all of us, whether we're conservationists or not, with a vital lesson about how natural assets that are oft neglected are actually our world's most enduring and most valuable assets. For those of us who live in Ohio, this book is essential. And perhaps it's not a coincidence that it took a man reared in Cleveland to pen this wisdom. Our state, and in particular our part of Ohio, is truly unique in all the world due to an amazing breadth and depth of natural resource endowments that give rise to literally billions of dollars of economic activity every single month. These endowments, what we often term natural assets, include extraordinary and rare farming soils, fresh water supplies that are abundant, energy resources such as solar, wind, oil, and gas, not to mention our own Great Lake Erie with the many ports and rivers that connect to it as well. And most of these assets are actually economic golden geese. They provide year in and year out, unlike a diminishing asset. And today, we're going to learn more about how these natural assets are the most valuable things in the world. As a Clevelander, as the CEO of the world's largest conservation organization, and as a leader in the investment banking world as well, Mark is uniquely and perfectly qualified to be the exponent of these important truths about enduring prosperity and health. Please join me in welcoming Mark Tercek back to Cleveland.
Well, thanks very much. It's really nice to be here, Rich. Thanks for that nice introduction. And you kind of stole my punchline. You couldn't have said it better, how wonderful and important nature is, and that's what I am going to talk about. Now, your introduction was very nice, but you left out the part of my business career that I'm most proud of. My most important job, and really where I learned everything I know, happened here in Cleveland from about 1967 to 1971. I was a paper boy for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Collinwood area of Cleveland. At one point, it was the biggest route, we were told, of the Cleveland Plain Dealers paper system. Then there's another part of my career. So a lot of people often ask me, in fact, gosh, an investment banking career. I worked at Goldman Sachs for almost 25 years. An investment banking career, a Wall Street career, that's kind of a strange place for the Nature Conservancy to find its president and CEO. And when I got started in mid-2008, even I wondered if my background was exactly right. And I opened the book with the following anecdote. Early in my time at the Nature Conservancy at D.C., I was a rookie. I was at a big fancy event, somewhat like this. People were milling about, and it was a who's who of the national environmental leaders. Government leaders, elected officials, congressmen and senators from Capitol Hill. All of the major environmental organizations, CEOs were there, board members and trustees. The major foundations were there. And it was a little bit intimidating. I was a new guy, and this was a new world for me. And there was one gentleman in particular who caught my attention and seemed like a very important person. He was an older gentleman in his 90s, very fit, looked like all business. I could see everybody was being very respectful toward him. And it dawned on me that he must have been Russell Train. Now, you won't all know who Russell Train is, and sadly, Mr. Train passed away about 1 year ago. But Russell Train was the first chairman of the President's Environmental Council. He was the second administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. He was the founder of WWF, the Worldwide Wildlife Fund. And he was just one of the giants in our field. So I thought I should go over and introduce myself. So I went over, explained who I was, and he looked at me, kind of looked me up and down. And he said, rather gruffly, but not unkindly, "How the hell did you get from Wall Street to the Nature Conservancy?" And I sort of fumbled for an answer. But if I had been a little quicker on my feet, this is what I would have told him. And this is what I really wrote in my book. Because in fact, I think it's a time for the environmental movement where it's very useful to have different perspectives, different backgrounds. We should step back and consider new approaches. Now, why do I say that? I couldn't have more respect for the environmental movement. And I know how honored and privileged I am to be the leader of the Nature Conservancy. What environmentalists have accomplished, environmental organizations, is extraordinary. And it's due to their great teams, their great staffs, and their dedication. It's especially due to their volunteer supporters and generous financial donors. But what the environmental organizations of the world have accomplished and our country is extraordinary. Take TNC just as one example. The Nature Conservancy today is a 4,000 person staff. We're in every state and another 35 countries. We have 600 scientists. We have an operating budget that's almost $600 million a year now. And we have done amazing things. And we're just one great environmental organization. There are many others. And you might have your favorite. But I know them all pretty well now, and I have great respect for all of them. But notwithstanding the determination of these organizations, their talented and energetic staffs, and their great and generous backers, we also have to look at the facts. At TNC, we say we're a science-driven organization, and that means looking at the facts. And if you look at the facts tell us we environmentalists aren't really completely getting the job done. We've got to take our work up to a new and better and bigger level. Now, why do I say that? Imagine you are me, and you have my job, leading the Nature Conservancy. You can think about the kinds of things I might want more of. My organization, we'd like to see, healthier and more robust rainforests. We'd like to see healthier coral reefs. We'd like for the world to have better, pure, clean, healthy water supply systems. We would like to see more biodiversity itself. I could go on and on. But sadly, all of those things can be measured, and all of those things are in sharp decline. Or you could think about it the other way. There are things we would like to see less of. Just take, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. Notwithstanding all our efforts connected to climate change, and notwithstanding some decent progress here in the U.S. recently, globally, carbon emissions continue to set new records year after year after year. And by the way, when we look ahead, it's not going to get any easier. Today, the world's population is about 7 billion people. Most prognosticators guess the population of the world will be about 9 billion people by 2050. More significantly from an environmental perspective, the world's middle class is growing. Now, I happen to think that's a good thing. Billions of people will be lifted out of poverty. That means they'll have better homes. They'll have better nutrition for their children, better health options, better educational alternatives, access to electricity. These are good things. It's good to see these people being lifted out of poverty. But as those billions of people rise out of poverty and become consumers, that will mean demand for energy, more demand, energy, water, space. There'll be infrastructure that goes with that. And all of that economic development could be a threat, a real threat, to the ecosystems we want to protect. And then finally, if that's not enough, you have to throw climate change into the mix, which will challenge us in everything we seek to do. Currently productive ag land will likely become desiccated, requiring farms to expand, and so on. So we have our hands full, we environmentalists, and we have to take our work up to another level, and we have to think about doing things in new ways. And that's why I think my bosses, the Nature Conservancy's board, was kind of daring for them, but I think smart for them to consider a candidate with a different kind of background like mine. Now, what do we do about that? Environmentalists, I think, should be humble about our respective strategies. It's not like anyone has figured out all the answers. And at the Nature Conservancy, we try to be humble. We're always open to input, et cetera. But one of my ideas, and I think most of my colleagues share this, is sometimes we environmentalists make a mistake when we talk about our love of nature. You know, we're environmentalists. We love nature. We want to protect nature because we think it's just the right thing to do. We want to protect nature because we want our children, and God willing, in my case, grandchildren someday, to have a natural world that's as abundant as the one I've experienced. But sometimes when we talk about nature that way, we talk about nature like, isn't nature wonderful? I think we sometimes convey to other people who are not environmentalists that nature is kind of a luxury good, something to take care of when you've taken care of everything else, something that the well-off can worry about, but not something that poor countries can worry about or make a priority, not something that deserves to be a priority when the economy is weaker. I think that's exactly wrong. That's what my book is about. In fact, I think it's poorer people who most depend on nature. That's the argument I try to make in the book, why protecting nature is the smartest investment we can make. Think of nature, if you will, as natural capital or as green infrastructure. So as business people or as citizens, we're, of course, very familiar with how business relies on the assets on its balance sheet. And governments have the responsibility of investing in the infrastructure that our society and economy needs. My argument is we can think of nature the same way. And even better, nature can sometimes be a much better deal than man-made infrastructure or gray infrastructure. So we want to think about nature as green infrastructure. Doing so, I believe, will do a couple of powerful things for environmentalists and the environmental movement and our ability to scale up our work and make a bigger difference. I think it can broaden the constituency that supports the environment, and we really need that. We need more people on our side. I think it can result in more dollars to invest into protecting the environment, and we need more financial resources. And maybe most importantly, and I'm only recently becoming aware of this, fully aware of this, talking about nature this way causes environmentalists, I think, to have a better dialogue with society. Sometimes we environmentalists make the mistake of getting up on our soapbox like this and saying, you should do this and you shouldn't do that. And I've come to learn people don't like to be told by environmentalists what they should or shouldn't do. But when we think about natural capital or green infrastructure, we begin to think collaboratively about solving problems on kind of a win-win basis. And I think that's a much more productive way to have conversations about the environment. Let me give you a couple of examples. I'll give you 3 examples to help you better understand what I mean. So example number 1, we'll go to Quito, Ecuador. Quito is the capital city of Ecuador. If you should ever go visit the Galapagos, you'll probably fly into Quito. It's a booming city. It's experiencing good economic growth. So a few years back, the municipal water company was concerned about whether it would have enough clean water for the growing population and the booming economy of Quito. And so they were making plans to invest in additional plant and equipment, gray infrastructure, to ensure they would be able to clean water and have enough clean water. Our local team showed up and made a very clever argument or a proposal. It was an economic proposal, not an environmental proposal. And the proposal was, to the water company, you can save money by investing in nature to secure clean water. It will be less expensive than the plant and equipment. And our idea was a rather simple one. It was stuff that TNC knew how to do. But by changing some ranching and farming practices upstream, in a way, by the way, that was in the best interest of the ranchers and farmers upstream, by altering those practices, we could keep the water supply, the watershed in very good shape. It'd be a lower cost way to secure the clean water. So the municipal water company said, fair enough, let's try it. And so the Nature Conservancy kicked in some money. The water company kicked in some money. It was a very small amount of money. And with that money, we went up, trained farmers and ranchers on how to do business a little bit differently. We put up fences to keep cattle away from the river. We did plantings along the river to prevent sedimentation, soil from falling into the river. We used ditches to keep fertilizer from running into the river. Really not very complex interventions. And it seemed to work. And so then we recruited the Coca-Cola franchisor serving Quito and the beer company, the brewer, to join our fund. So we had a little bit more money to work with. It continued to go well. And so then the water company was able to get the authority to charge every water user in Quito a small fee to pay for this conservation. Now, they would have paid a bigger fee if we hadn't showed up. The fee would have been bigger to pay for that plant and equipment. But they paid a fee, a smaller one, for conservation, and a couple of wonderful things happened as a result of this, in my opinion. First, everybody who used water in Quito became an environmentalist, a practical environmentalist, whether they even knew that or not at the time, because they came to understand we are investing dollars and cents into conservation upstream for a very practical reason, to obtain clean water. So it was kind of an aha moment. And you know, these people, the citizens of Quito, they're not the kind of people who, in most cases, would have probably responded very well if I showed up and lectured them on what they should or shouldn't do. By the way, the area that we were protecting upstream, this watershed, was the Condor Bioreserve of Ecuador. We would have wanted to protect it anyway. It just happened also to be the watershed. So first of all, there's a change in awareness, a broadening of support for conservation. Second of all, and remember, this was in my early days when I joined the Conservancy. I have an investment banking background, a degree in finance. I can't help but think about money. We had the world's financial crisis at the time. Conservation costs a lot of money, so I was already worrying, where will we get all the funds we need to take our work to higher and bigger levels? Here we had conservation that paid for itself. If we don't screw this up, we'll continue to need clean water so long as it continues to be a good economic proposition, a lower cost way to get that clean water by investing in nature. The cycle will continue. So it's conservation that can pay for itself. Then we said, boy, this is such an elegant scheme. Why don't we try to expand it and replicate it? So we raised a little bit more money from the FEMSA Foundation. So FEMSA is the Coca-Cola franchisor for all of Latin America, highly dependent on water, interested in water conservation. That was one partner. Our other partner was the Inter-American Development Bank, kind of a World Bank type organization focused on Latin America. And then the Nature Conservancy raised some money. And with that money, we seeded now, we'll soon have 25 of these water funds across Latin America. They're each a little bit different, but they're all a variation of the same thing. Users of water, paying for conservation, protecting nature to obtain clean water. For example, in another case, I was there recently to visit in Colombia. Our partners doing this are sugarcane growers. I don't know if you know much about Colombian sugarcane growers. I never did until I met with them. They're not what you would think of as tree-hugging environmentalists. They're burly guys who are in the sugarcane business. But they know they need clean water, and they've been great partners of ours. And so now we have 25 of these funds. So we're really doing some conservation now at real scale. From a philanthropic perspective, the return on the initial philanthropic investment is enormous. Because, again, once we get the flywheel turning, the projects pay for themselves. Now we want to do bigger projects. So we're talking to the water authorities in Sao Paulo. So Sao Paulo is a booming city in Brazil, a huge city. It draws its water principally from the Atlantic forest. The Atlantic forest was once one of the hemisphere's great forests, but it's become sadly degraded. And we're now arguing to the water authorities, just shift some of the hundreds of millions of dollars you spend on keeping your water infrastructure intact and growing for your booming city. Just shift some of that money to protecting the Atlantic forest, and in that way you'll lower your cost of obtaining healthy, clean water. And so you can see that's what I mean by investing in nature. There are all sorts of co-benefits. We're accomplishing conservation at great scale. We're not doing it philanthropically, though. We're doing it in order to obtain clean water. We're not doing it with our traditional supporters. We're doing it with everyone who needs clean water, which is, of course, everyone. That's what we mean about protecting nature. That's how we can broaden our support for our environmental goals. We can raise money, etc. But you might say, fine, Mark, that's an interesting story from Latin America. What about something closer to home? Here's a closer to home example. 2008, we're in the grips of the economic crisis. President Obama is executing the stimulus plan, originally formulated by the President Bush administration, but executed by the Democrats. I know everybody doesn't like it, but you'll remember the administration was looking for shovel-ready jobs to stimulate the economy. So the good old Nature Conservancy went up to Capitol Hill, knocked on some doors, and said, we have some shovel-ready jobs. And we raised funding to rebuild oyster reefs in the Gulf. So I think this is really quite encouraging. What we proved with that stimulus plan, we created some jobs right away, so it was a good stimulus program. But what we now have A to Z categorical evidence for is that if you're considering a seawall in the Gulf, for $1 million, we can build an oyster reef seawall. That's about the same thing the gray infrastructure, the man-made seawall, costs. So let's compare the two infrastructures, the man-made seawall to the oyster reef. Cost about the same. Their principal job is to reduce erosion, a big deal in the Gulf, and to provide protection from storms, also a big deal. They score about equally there. Okay, now, what about the life of the asset? Well, like all gray infrastructure, all man-made infrastructure, it depreciates in value over time. Everyone who studies accounting knows you have to factor in depreciation. My oyster reef should hold its value. It might even appreciate in value over time if we take good care of it. So right off the bat, the oyster reef, I think, is ahead. But the oyster reef, of course, is an oyster reef. It's not just a seawall. What does an oyster reef do? Well, it provides habitat for oysters. Oysters are a pretty important part of the local economy. The fishing communities and tourism communities of the Gulf like having those oysters there. Plus, oysters clean water. Plus, the oyster shells ultimately crumble. The shells are washed to the shore, and they nourish the beach. The oyster reefs also provide habitat for birds and fish, also good for the local economy. And, of course, there are all the environmental benefits that come from restoring these oyster reefs. Then the storyline now gets even more interesting. One of the great environmental wins of this past 18 months or so on the legislative front. We haven't had very many wins recently on Capitol Hill, but we had one important win last year, the Restore Act. The Restore Act calls, and it passed, the Restore Act calls for the BP oil finds in the Gulf to principally be reinvested in restoring the Gulf's ecosystems. And so we now have evidence. As the government officials determine how best to invest those large amounts of money, billions of dollars, in restoring the Gulf's ecosystems, we now have really good evidence that investing in oyster reefs kind of creates this win-win-win-win opportunity. Protection from storms, protection from erosion, oysters, fish, birds, beach nourishment. Good for the local economy, both the food economy and the tourism economy. That, I think, is really exciting. So that's another example of natural capital. And you can tell in this story, again, more resources, more support, a more practical way for us to do our business. Okay, then one last example, even more recent. Hurricane Sandy. I don't want to be glib about Hurricane Sandy. I moved to D.C. for the Nature Conservancy job, but I used to be a New Yorker for 25 years. Hurricane Sandy was devastating in New York and New Jersey, and certain coastal communities are still suffering. So I don't mean to be glib about this, but sometimes there is a silver lining in these environmental problems. Here's one thing that happened. A couple things happened in Hurricane Sandy. I've been quite involved. I served on Governor Cuomo's commission right afterwards. And we could talk about that in Q&A if you would like. But before Sandy, there's a coastal community in New Jersey called Cape May. And Cape May, they're beautiful homes located very near the shoreline. And the residents of Cape May were concerned about flood and storm risk. And so with the Nature Conservancy's help and some other organizations, we all agreed, and we raised some money to do this, that we would restore wetlands and dunes because we believed, and the residents of Cape May believed, that these wetlands and dunes would provide very good protection from storms and floods. Now, we did not have in mind storms and floods of Hurricane Sandy proportions, but right after we finished this project, that's what happened. And it's rather remarkable. Cape May suffered much less damage than local adjacent communities. It's remarkable. We even have very dramatic photos that will show you that. So now we're doing the work to really make that evidence quite black and white. But we have another instance of low-cost investments in nature with all sorts of environmental benefits that go with it, provide very practical things for us. So that's I could go on and on with these examples, and in the book I do exactly that. I talk about examples in the ag space, in fisheries, in cities. It's remarkable. If you use this mindset, I think you can really kind of unlock the door to a new way of pursuing environmental business. I don't argue that it's the only approach, but it is a win-win approach that allows us for more support, more money, and a different way for environmentalists to talk about the work they do. Now, I can't help but think about working with the private sector because for 25 years I worked with the private sector. You know, and as an investment banker, I know people, investment banking, the popularity of investment banks has fallen, not today's topic. But over my career, I got to work with a lot of America's great companies and a lot of the world's great companies. And I always, this might sound naive, but I don't think it's naive. I've always had a lot of confidence in capitalism and the private sector and have believed the private sector can be harnessed to be a powerful force for good. And that had a lot to do with my motives for joining the Nature Conservancy. And so I've been interested in applying the concepts that I've been talking about to work with big companies. And this deserves a little bit of discussion because it deserves some disclosure. This sometimes makes traditional supporters of the Nature Conservancy a bit nervous. So one of our big partners these days is Dow Chemical. I've been very involved with this project. So the backdrop is Andrew Livers is the CEO of Dow Chemical. He's trained as an engineer. He's a smart guy. He understands that environmental issues are a big deal across the board. They're a global company, and he knows it's a big deal for Dow Chemical. And he heard me kind of prattling on and on like this about natural capital, and so afterwards he challenged me. He said, Mark, if you're right about this natural capital concept, and I think you are, then it must be the case that Dow Chemical relies on natural capital. And it must also be the case that that natural capital, that green infrastructure, is vulnerable from environmental degradation. Shouldn't we know that? Shouldn't we value that? Shouldn't we figure out what we should do about that? So I thought that was a great challenge. And so the Nature Conservancy signed up for a very big 5-year project with Dow Chemical to explore exactly that. Now, as soon as we announced that, lots of my friends, lots of traditional supporters of the Nature Conservancy, certainly environmentalists kind of on the left, challenged me. They said, Mark, why would you ever work with a company like Dow Chemical? Its environmental track record historically has not been so good. Its environmental footprint is enormous. And I said, exactly. That's exactly why I think we should try to work with companies like Dow Chemical, because if we can show them that it is in their business best interest to take better care of the environment, and particularly that part of the environment that they depend on, then that should go a long way to creating new allies for our movement. Because in business, I know one thing. If you have a good idea, it's replicated fast. Business people steal one another's best ideas. So we're off to work now with Dow Chemical. Now, the project's been interesting in ways that I didn't even anticipate. So we're doing a big pilot in the States, another one in Brazil, and another one in China with Dow. So 3 big pilots. We started in Texas. I wrote about this in the book, too. But some of the stuff I'll say is new. It didn't make the deadline for the book. So to get started, I mean, this was a big deal in the Nature Conservancy. We get that there are risks working with the private sector. We know it would be bad to screw up here. And so we're being very careful. So I formed the best team I could. So we took some of our very best scientists and said, you're going to work on this Dow project. And I sent them to Freeport, Texas. And Andrew Livers thinks this is a big deal to do so. He took some of his best engineers and sent them to Freeport, Texas. So they went down for a couple of days, kind of workshop, brainstorming session on this project, and then returned to headquarters. So my scientists came back, and guess what they said? They said, you know, Mark, I don't want to work on this project. We don't like those Dow engineers. They don't care about the things we care about. They don't speak the same language we speak. It's like, you know, oil and water. This isn't going to work. I called up Andrew Livers. He said, oh, guess what? Same thing on my side. My engineers don't like your scientists. Arrogant, they think they know everything, condescending to engineers. Our guys don't want to work with your guys anyway. This is where I've learned. It's fun to be CEO sometimes. So I said to my scientists, great, go back to work. Andrew Livers did the same thing. And with some effort and some time, of course, they kind of got on the same wavelength. And the project is making a lot of progress. But to me, this was a big deal because it helped me understand this is where environmentalists sometimes err very, very badly. Sometimes people say about the ideas in the book, they say, these are not new ideas. And in the book, I say that very explicitly. They are not new ideas. What's new, I think, and encouraging and exciting is we're taking ideas and making them actionable. And the way you do that is environmentalists have to get off the podium, roll up their sleeves, and go work with engineers. We don't invest in infrastructure as environmentalists. Governments do and businesses do. And so I think this working together closely is actually quite a big breakthrough. Then you might say, well, what kind of stuff is coming out of this Dow project? It's early days. We're publishing, though, as we go, because we want to disclose everything. We don't want our critics to think we're doing anything, you know, mysterious or nefarious or private. We'll soon be publishing in peer-reviewed science journals, too. And we're very open. If someone thinks we're making mistakes or we can do this better in different ways, great. You know, we want to do it as best we can. But these are the kinds of things we're learning. First, it's kind of an obvious one, and it won't surprise you. Most of Dow's big facilities are on coasts for transportation reasons. That's true of the Freeport facility. And so, of course, you know, the Dow engineers are worried about storm risk and sea level rise risk. And so they had very well-developed plans for seawalls again. Our scientists think the marshes there, the wetlands and marshes, might provide, it's a little bit like the Oyster Reef example, those ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, might provide lower cost and more resilient protection from storms, also with many community benefits and environmental benefits. But the problem on our end is we didn't have the data that was robust enough to satisfy what an engineer needs to make a big bet like that. When the Dow engineers, make their decision about the infrastructure that will protect the plant from storms and sea level rise, they need to be right. They need to have a very high degree of confidence. And our theory was insufficient. And so we environmentalists, including our scientists, learned something very important. We've got to translate our theory and science into the kinds of plans that engineers can confidently invest on. So that's one piece of work that's underway. We don't know yet whether the man-made seawall or the coastal ecosystem will work. And some of my colleagues were worried about that too, but I said, no, it will be good to know the truth. So they're still plugging away there. There's another interesting example which surprised us. Just hanging around, you learn things. So hanging around the Dow team in Texas, we learned the plant was scheduled for some expansion, and that expansion would require, from EPA regs, more investment in scrubbers for local air pollution issues. And so then our scientists said, well, wait a second. We think reforestation, new tree plantings in this area might address those pollution issues. And the EPA is very close to approving this. And so the plan would be, again, at a lower cost than the scrubbers, to plant trees up and down the Brazos River that would protect that important water source for the plant but the local communities. It might also be, we don't know this yet, but it might be the case, due to wind patterns, that we can plant trees in Houston, a perfectly fine city, but a hot one that's getting hotter, and they could use some more trees. Dow might be able to plant trees in Houston to address these local air pollution issues. And again, it could be one of these win-win-wins. Address your local air pollution issues, make some smart investments in nature for the environment, make some investments that would be welcomed by the local community. That's the kind of stuff that's coming out of our partnership with Dow, and I'm pretty excited about. So I could go on and on like this, but I won't, because it's time to wrap up. But if I could go back now and see the late Mr. Train and have that conversation again, that's how I would have answered. But I would have quickly said, I would have said, so you see, an investment banker's approach to nature can be a way to broaden our support base, raise important funds for our work, and change the way environmentalists have their dialogue with the rest of society. All very good. But I would have also said and emphasized, and I will say this to you today, that I also know, even though I was an investment banker, it's certainly not all about dollars and cents. The arguments I make in the book and the arguments I've made briefly today, I think, are worthy of the environmental movement's careful attention and often can be a very good way to move forward. But at the end of the day, I think our most important motives should be where most environmentalists start. We do love nature. We do want to leave to our kids and grandkids a world that's as healthy and as vital and as rewarding as a natural world that we've experienced. And for all of you, if that message makes any sense, sometimes people say, well, what can we do? Well, there's a lot you can do. I mean, first, I hope you'll support the environmental organizations of your choice. The Nature Conservancy is one very worthy organization, but there are a lot of others. I'm not here to pitch ours. I'm here to pitch all of them. They're all staffed by extraordinarily hardworking people, more than I really realized. They're all under-resourced. They're all doing extraordinarily important things, thanks to their generous supporters. But we could use more support. That's one thing I'll note. Second thing I'll note is you're all citizens. Some of you are young, but most of you are citizens who are old enough to be voters. We do need, and I didn't have time to talk about it today, but it could be a very robust talk. We do need enlightened, science-based, highly engaged governments, both with smart regulatory policy and as smart investors in infrastructure on our side. The stakes are very high. So your citizens, your voters, please be engaged on that front. Then with regard to the private sector, many of you are business leaders, or you're investors, you're certainly customers. Do what you can to encourage the private sector to get in the game. There are more and more examples of private companies very wisely supporting the environmental movement and doing it in a way that absolutely strengthens their business results, strengthens their bottom line, enhances shareholder value. I haven't come across a company that doesn't have those kinds of strategies. But sometimes they're timid. Sometimes they don't understand that. Use your clout to get them to do that. And then finally, of course, your family members. And some of you are parents and some of you are grandparents. Inculcate in your families a love of nature and spread the word and carry on. Thanks very much for listening to me today. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Mark. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum with Mark Tercek, CEO of the Nature Conservancy. We will return momentarily for our traditional City Club question and answer period. But first, a few announcements. We encourage you to formulate your questions for our speaker and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those listening to 90.3 WCPN Idea Stream, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC, and our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We welcome guests today at tables hosted by the Cleveland Zoological Society, Davy Tree Expert Company, the Nature Conservancy, and OPT Solutions. Thank you all for your support. And today's forum is the annual Norman A. Sugarman Forum and James S. Lipscomb Forum, which recognize generous gifts to the City Club Forum Foundation. Joining us at the head table today in honor of Jim Lipscomb are Barbara Lipscomb and her son Bill Lipscomb, and in honor of Norm Sugarman are his nephew John Green and Paul Feinberg from Norm's law firm Baker and Hostetler. Would our special guests please stand and be recognized? Thank you. We would also like to welcome students from Chagrin Falls High School, Mentor High School, and Jane Addams Business Career Center. Students are here today as part of the City Club student program. Today's student attendance is made possible by a generous gift from the Jeffrey David Epstein Student Memorial Fund. Would our student guests please stand and be recognized? Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from members and guests alike. Holding the microphones today are Development Associate Michael Cromaldi and Program Director Carrie Miller. First question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Tercek, for being here. In addition to Cleveland having a growing interest in Superman, we've had an ongoing interest in leaf cover. And I'd like to ask you to speak to, if you can, more about the value of leaf cover in general, and specifically about trees on urban streets such as downtown streets, and if there are any models as to how people have been able to green those streets in that way.
Okay, thanks for asking about cities. I might not be the expert you need to answer the question specifically about the benefits of leaf coverage, but I'm really excited about the Nature Conservancy's more active presence in cities. So, as I mentioned, I grew up in Cleveland. I grew up in the Collinwood section of Cleveland. So, unlike some environmental leaders, I've got a very urban background, and I've lived my whole life in cities. So when I arrived at TNC, most of our great work has been done in the great outdoors, and of course we're very proud of that. But I asked our chief scientist, I said, can't we do more work in cities? And it turned out that there was this kind of pent-up demand within TNC to be more engaged in cities. And there's a lot we can do. By the way, I therefore wrote a chapter about that in the book. Nature makes a big difference. Nature makes a very big difference in cities. Where to start? Lots of, I don't know the situation in Cleveland, but many cities across the U.S. have sewage systems that are antiquated. And when there are intense storms, you have sewage overflow. It's true in most places. It's kind of an unattractive thing even to think about. Well, we're in an era now where we're going to have more storms, and it appears they're going to be more intense, and we're going to have more instances of sewage overflow. And the consequences of sewage overflow are as nasty as you would imagine. What can we do about that? A lot of it is, what nature can do is it can slow the water down. And so we have a big project in Philadelphia right now, and this may sound, you might not believe it, but it's true. Green roofs, including planters on roofs, small parks, more permeable surfaces, more trees planted in the city, all act like a giant sponge and absorb and slow down water when there are big storms. Now, they do a lot of other great things that, again, we'd like to see as environmentalists, and they definitely make a city more valuable and more attractive and a nicer place to be. But we're compiling, we think, very impressive and compelling evidence that investments in green infrastructure along those lines will reduce the cost of investments, huge investments, in retrofitting these sewage systems. And there's huge interest in that work right now because almost every older city faces this issue, and the EPA is cracking down and requiring the new investments in infrastructure. So that's one thing. Second thing is my Sao Paulo example. around the world, I mean, urbanization around the world, I think by 2030 we're expecting like 70% of the world's people will live in cities. Many of those cities, by the way, are coastal. So green infrastructure can provide protection from storms and sea level rise. That was the work we did with Governor Cuomo. That was very interesting. Maybe a digression, but I think interesting for you. So immediately after Hurricane Sandy, it was devastating, right? Governor Cuomo formed a commission of people to form recommendations, and he wanted them by New Year's for his State of the State speech. What should the state of New York do to protect itself from future Hurricane Sandy type events? The commission was big. It was mostly academics, engineers, the private sector, insurance companies, energy companies, transportation sector companies, the financial industry, just like you would expect. And then there were two environmentalists. The TNC, I represented TNC in one other organization. So I say that because it was not a green group. Governor Cuomo's recommendations then in his State of the State speech were sea level rise, storms, these are real risks, and New York has to deal with them. And second, he said, green infrastructure is every bit as important as gray infrastructure. And investments in ecosystems to prepare against storms are as important as investments in seawalls and these kinds of things. So that's a second place where nature makes a big difference in cities. And then the third place I'd say would be trees and cities, and my Dow example hints at that. Cities have pollution issues. They will have temperature issues. We're compiling the evidence now to make the case that you can actually, through tree plantings, lower the temperature in cities. We could go on and on. So I think the period ahead is going to be an exciting period where conservationists like us direct more of our attention to cities. That's in our best interest, too, because as the world becomes more urban, we want the residents of these cities around the world, not just in the U.S., to better understand why nature is so important. Thanks for your question.
It seems to me that in addition to overpopulation, one of the biggest threats to the global environment is large-scale resource extraction. I'm from Alaska, and we're always fighting battles about oil, gas, hard rock, rare earth, mineral extraction. And I'm wondering how you counter the argument, the economic arguments of the value of those resources that are extracted, the commercial values of those, and the jobs created by those, and how do you counter those arguments and say that we have to protect the environment rather than do the extraction?
Right. Thank you for asking about that. So that's something we have to think really carefully about. And here's my point of view on that. Sometimes the right thing for environmentalists to say is no. Sometimes mining activity is proposed in extraordinarily precious ecosystems, and it's simply not worth it. But the right answer, in my view, can't always be no. The economy is growing. People, as I noted, people are rising up from the middle class. And as economies grow and as the lifestyles improve, the products that come out of those mines are simply needed by people. And indeed in our own lives, in our own lifestyles. You know, all those fancy gadgets we use for communication rely on output from mines. And so, so at least sometimes, I think actually quite often, rather than say no, environmentalists should say how. How can this mining activity happen on a basis whereby damage is minimized, environmental damage is minimized, and offset so that we can come out of it with the best of both worlds? What we need for economic growth and for lifting people out of poverty and for jobs, but also to protect the ecosystems that continued economic prosperity depends on. Here's one example of the way we do it, also a little bit controversial. Another one of my partners is Rio Tinto, one of the world's very biggest mining companies. But Rio Tinto, you know, it's interesting, again, without us telling them this, they concluded on their own that the world was changing. They didn't have an evergreen license to operate however they wanted everywhere in the world. Thanks to the internet revolution, communication revolution, continued gains in education, citizens around the world don't want their local ecosystems spoiled unnecessarily. So a country where we're very engaged and we're really excited about our work is Mongolia. Mongolia was a ward of the Soviet Union. It was kind of a sleepy place in between China and Russia. Even today, something like half the people of Mongolia live in nomadic sheep-herding families. Soviet Union unwound. They ditched Mongolia, and Mongolia was suddenly on its own, having to figure out, they were subsidized. How will we grow? Turns out Mongolia, so here you have a country, young leaders, I think good people. They had nomadic backgrounds. They really want to protect their very precious and beautiful ecosystems, grasslands and deserts. On the other hand, they need economic growth because somehow they have to make it. Their people want economic growth just like everyone else does around the world, and they're quite rich in minerals. So we're working with Rio Tinto and Mongolia's government in the Gobi Desert. The desert's in very good shape. Rio Tinto is building one of the biggest mines ever in the world. Using our science, we're trying to locate the mine and the infrastructure in a way that it does a minimal amount of environmental harm. So just up front, if you use science for planning, you can avoid a lot of unnecessary harm. That's part one. But of course, harm occurs. These mines are big, ugly, impactful things. And so then Rio Tinto had already committed before us they would more than offset that harm by protecting like habitat. And so they're using our science to guide that offset investment so that we can protect what we think are the most precious parts of the Gobi Desert. Then we hope to use the example of Rio Tinto and the governor of Mongolia's clout, but it's hard because it's an economy now that's booming and it's a young government. But we're going to try to use that example in the government to get the other players in Mongolia to make the same kind of commitment. For example, PetroChina is a big player in Mongolia. Can we persuade them to make the same kind of commitments Rio does? If we can. We haven't yet, but we're on the case. We could come out of this with well-designed mines that minimize harm for the economic growth and prosperity of Mongolia, and with protected areas that could be as much as a third of the Gobi Desert. And then at the end of the day, and these mines last a long time, but at the end of the day, Rio Tinto has already signed up to reclaim that land, and it can be done. It takes extra financial resources. It takes science. That's how we'd like to do that. We're still not satisfied, though, with that, because then you might say, fine, a one-off example, not bad, but what about all the other mines that are going to be built around the world? So then we're trying to get Rio Tinto, I think we can do this, to get them to make the same commitment to do that with all of their mines. And then, working with Rio Tinto and some other leading mining companies, get the entire mining sector to understand it's in their best interest to do business this way. That's why Rio Tinto is doing this. They're not doing it to be nice. It's not corporate social responsibility or philanthropy. They've concluded, and I think they're very wise to reach this conclusion, this is a better way for them to run their business. It costs a little bit more money, but it's trivial relative to the amount of money invested in these mines. And if you presume, because of these extra steps, there's less regulatory hassle, less trouble with environmentalists along the way, you could more than recover that investment just by having a little bit of a faster time period. And then, of course, the people who work for Rio Tinto, they're competing for people. They want to hire, the people they want to hire, young people want to work for companies with responsible programs like this, and so on. So that's what we're trying to do. Now, I can't tell you we've proved it when we've pulled all that off yet, but I sure think it's worthy of a very good effort. And I'm cautiously optimistic we can do that.
Mr. Tercek, this is a personal question about you. You're a very articulate, knowledgeable speaker on the whole efforts of the to make nature apply to the air, water, and land. And coming from a business background that you have with Goldman Sachs, it makes it all the more impressive. My question is, was there something special in your life that made it possible for you to make that change from the business world to this organization you had? And is it possible you can get other people who are likewise talented to do the same thing?
That's a very nice question. Thank you. I do a lot of talks. People don't usually ask me nice questions like that. Thank you very much. You know, my mom is here, so my mom... My mom probably deserves credit. Excuse me. Second part of your question, though, is a really big deal to me. Can I get other people to follow me? Yeah, I think we can. I think I'm really kind of lucky. It might surprise you. People like to bash Wall Street firms these days. But the Goldman Sachs that I worked in for 24 years actually encouraged people to do exactly the kind of thing that I'm doing. And so to me, it felt rather natural, my own transition. Again, sometimes when I say that, people don't believe it, but that was my experience. And I have a number of former colleagues who are doing things comparable to what I'm doing. So I had the good fortune of working for a good firm that was led by really good people. But the important thing I want to note is we are trying to get folks to transition from the private sector into the environmental space. And I think this would be a good thing for all nonprofits to do. Now, of course, at the Nature Conservancy, we have great people who have worked there for a very long time. And you'll see that in our Ohio chapter. And we need those people. They're great. They're trained in environmental matters, conservation, they're scientists. It's an incredible group of people. You know, when I worked on Wall Street, we always called ourselves the best of the brightest. It's kind of obnoxious in hindsight. But the people of Nature Conservancy, you know, they're very much the match of the people of Goldman Sachs. But I do think organizations like ours benefit from a diversity of viewpoint. And I really do think that my board, when they chose to hire me or someone like me, that was a courageous and visionary thing to do. So mixing it up a little bit and having people from the private sector in the nonprofit sector, I think would be very good. And it's probably the reverse is probably true too. You know, these worlds are all converging, and so you know, smart businesses in our space are hiring environmentalists to be on their teams to help them think through these issues. Anyway, thanks for your nice question.
What made you keep when you were younger, when you were our age? What made you keep pushing to get to the point in your life, to get where you are now? What made you wake up every day and say, I want to be successful? How did you?
Now you're going to make me get emotional again. This is a nice club. Nobody asks questions like this. You know, I mentioned my paper out when I was little. I honestly really wasn't exaggerating. As a young kid, I learned a good work ethic. And I was able to sustain it, I think. Anyway, that would be my advice to you young guys. Work hard and do things where you work with good people from whom you can learn a lot. And if you're doing anything that gets boring, look for something new to do. Try not to be bored and keep learning. Work with good people who will teach you a lot. I've benefited from that my whole life, so I'm really very fortunate in that respect. It's a great question. Thanks.
We'll see if we can't keep the streak going here.
Oh, no. Usually people ask me tough questions about, you know, environmental matters.
This is Cleveland. We're easy. In keeping up with what you learned, and you have a remarkable background and schooling and so forth, going back to early education, what kind of lessons did you learn at St. Jerome's from either Sister Adelaide?
Stop.
Or Mr. Simonelli, science and public policy? And I'll bridge it so you don't have to talk about you. Where do we do that? So your mother's here, and she brought that out in you. Do you see the Nature Conservancy making an investment in education, especially in young education, to do this? Because you can tell people, but if you don't teach them, and if you're only on the soapbox, they're not going to learn it for themselves.
It's like memory lane today. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about St. Jerome's, but I did go to St. Jerome's. It's a good school. It's still there on Lakeshore Boulevard in Collinwood. We think a lot about young people. I'm actually quite encouraged about young people. But here's how we think about it at the Nature Conservancy. So we're sort of a science-based organization, so we always look at data. And so when I joined TNC, my chief scientist said to me, Mark, your kids, if they're representative of average kids, they spend less than 1/3 the time outside that you did when you were a kid. So the first thing we're concerned about, so we're always wondering who will be the environmental supporters and champions of the future that we need. So we know young people today live more urban lifestyles and they're inside more. That's troubling because I'm sure for some of the supporters of TNC here, if we anecdotally ask you, how did you get interested in nature? Often it was powerful stuff you did outdoors as kids that made you environmentalists. So that's the first thing we're concerned about. Another thing we're concerned about is the environmental movement. This is an environmental movement concern broadly. It's not very diverse. It's mostly, not exclusively, but it's mostly a movement staffed by and supported by moderately well-to-do to very well-to-do white people. Well, that's another challenge for us because we know our country and the world is becoming more diverse. So what do we do about it? So we have a couple of ideas. We're pretty encouraged, though. A little bit goes a long way here. We have one program called LEAF. I can never remember what it stands for, but it's something like Leaders for Environmental Action of the Future. I think that's it, LEAF. It started very small. The Toyota Foundation asked us to do this and gave us some money. And all we did, it was very easy for us to do this. We took inner city high school kids from New York City, usually from pretty bad circumstances, and we made them summer interns on our projects out in nature. And often the motive of these kids was just, they were good kids, but they were new. They often had no experience in nature, hadn't even been outside the city, and sometimes their motive was just to find a safe place to be in the summer when school was out. So we took these kids, we put them on our project for the summer, and then they would go back to school. That program is now beyond New York City. It now has more than 500 graduates, and fully more than 1/3 have gone on to major in the sciences in college. That's extraordinary because the national average is like below 5%. And so it's another one of these advantages why we should think of nature as something to invest in. Exposing young people with some knowledge, so we had scientists involved, they were working in nature, seems to be, I mean, the statistics are extraordinary. Fully 1/3 of those kids majoring in the sciences, and now we're beginning to hire some of them back to work at the Nature Conservancy. So that's one program. Then we have some other ideas, but we have to be a little bit careful because we have to, all nonprofits make this mistake, and I sure don't want to, of letting our mission drift too much. But we had this little kind of small project where, for very little money, thanks to the wonders of information technology today, we created an online program for grade school classes using, because we have one asset, we've got scientists all over the world in these remote, beautiful places doing really exciting work that any kid would be interested to learn from. So we created lesson plans for teachers with internet-based reports from the field, and that's kind of grown like gangbusters too. But that we're thinking about now of turning over to somebody who's in the education business to really, manage that in an optimal way. So those are the kinds of things we are doing, and then occasionally, I don't get to do this as much as I'd like, but I do visit and we try to support college environmental programs. And I must say I'm quite impressed. When I visit a college, this is what normally happens. The professors are generally very conservative, very worried and nervous about some of our innovations, which is a little bit discouraging. But the students embrace them and can't wait to get going. And so I think there's reason for encouragement when we think about young people today. Is that it? Okay, thank you, everyone.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Mark Tercek, CEO of the Nature Conservancy. Thank you, Mr. Tercek. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
PNC is proud to support the presentation of this City Club of Cleveland Friday Forum on WVIZ PBS.
Additional support comes from Cleveland State University. Support for closed caption transcripts of City Club forums is provided by the Nordson Corporation Foundation.